Hello, Angelo, and
Hello.
thank you for accepting my invitation.
Thank you for inviting
Uh,
me.
it's a real pleasure for me. You're an anesthesiologist
Yes.
and a spiritual teacher and author. So your work is to put people asleep and to wake them up. So it's kind of interesting. And
Hmm.
you recently have published an excellent book called Awake, It's Your Turn. I read it and it's really good, really practical, and with a really broad range of themes. Maybe we can talk about it later.
Yes.
And you also have a YouTube channel on which you publish an incredible number of guided meditations and self-inquiry and interviews and teachings. And you have a productivity that I can't have at the moment. And I'm not ashamed to say that I envy you. And to begin with my first question, can you tell us about your journey, the journey
Mm.
that led you to share these methods and approaches to achieve awakening and liberation?
Sure. Yeah. So when I was growing up, I felt a lot of suffering, internal struggle. It was very much associated with thought. There was something I think anxiety would be a good term for it, but it felt deeper than anxiety to me. It felt like something fundamentally was off, not right. Something needed to be addressed, but I had no idea how to address it. And more importantly, the people I knew, people around me, the general um, messages you get from society, from media, none of that told me how to address it or even suggested that I could address it. I never really saw or felt any kind of pointer or advice or suggestion that said, hey, you can actually address that fundamental sense of being separate from everything, frustrated with the way your mind moves, the way life moves, struggling all the time internally. I just never knew, or didn't for many years know, that there's actually a way to directly address that. Also, now years later, it's more obvious to me. It's kind of a hidden secret that many people share. It's obvious to me now that to some degree, I think everybody has that. But for some people, it's much more acute or much more intense. But there's something about it where often don't talk about it. We tend not to talk about how much we're suffering. Now, we do in some way, and I think there's more and more awareness of mental health, things like depression and anxiety. But even that's the way we talk about it sounds like some affliction, some disease process, and to some degree those are. But again, it goes deeper. There's something about our actual identity, about who we take ourselves to be, that is really at the root of that suffering, and that's in my experience. So that's how I felt for many years, up until I was 24 years old. When I was 24, a series of things happened, some conditions in my life lined up, and some of what seemed like luck, serendipity. I read the right book. I read the right chapter of the right book. A few things happened. I figured something out about how to actually look at my thoughts. It all kind of happened over a period of maybe a couple of weeks, and it culminated in uh, a, um, a series. I would say a series of internal events. I'll say it that way, that occurred over a couple of days, and it completely changed everything about the way I experience reality. And not only, I mean, everything. And not only did it experience the way not only did it change the way I experience reality, the most important part of it is it fundamentally changed my experience of me. It changed the experiencer, And that's something I want to be really clear about, that we live in the information age, and then we live in the social information age. And now we live in the artificial intelligence information age. So information is plentiful. You can learn so much so fast. It's easy you can have AI synthesize it for you now through Chat GPT very easily. So we have access to tons of information. And some of that a lot of that information is self-help type information, how to address various issues in the mind and the body. This is great. All this stuff is great, but that's not what I'm talking about. That's not what happened to me. What happened to me was so fundamental that it was something that spanned, in one sense, beyond the confines of this lifetime. Like, it wasn't even in time, and it wasn't even in space. It was too fundamental to even be described as happening in time, in space, or to a certain person on a certain timeline. So it's very difficult to talk about. There's no language that exists today to talk directly and clearly about what I'm actually referring to. But it was pervasive, this change, this shift, and it didn't change back. So I might, just to put it in a very simple way, I might say I went from living in what felt like a very small enclosed mental space, even though it kind of looked like an external world. I didn't realize I was projecting the mind onto the external world. I was looking out and seeing what I thought was the world, but I was seeing my own ego. So it's very enclosed, tight, uncomfortable, struggling space, which a lot of people can relate to. There's many ways to refer to this. Thoreau called it the life of quiet desperation. I mean, there's many poetic references. There's many psychological references. But I went from that to I can't really describe it, but it's something like being all of the spaciousness, but also being where there is no space, being where there is no space or time, and yet being able to easily experience space-time in the way our minds function. Experiencing a kind of intimacy that I would have never known was possible. Intimacy meaning I feel it's almost as if the whole universe collapsed down inward into not even a body though, into the experience of this moment. And you sort of have access to everything in one sense, but not in a mental way, in a very physical, fundamentally free of identification way. Free of identification meaning when there's no separation, there's no identity. There's not someone that's experiencing non-separation. There's just non-separation. So it's, again, the language just does not have a way of talking about this. With this said, there are many people this has happened to. And what's interesting about this moment in time, this last, let's say 10, 20 years, something like that, especially the last few years, it's become very obvious that more and more people, I think this is happening to for sure. The internet's been very helpful. YouTube's been very helpful, giving people access to others who have gone through it or are going through it. So I don't want this to sound elitist, or I don't want anyone hearing this to sound like, whoa, that could never possibly happen to me. It definitely can happen to you. Absolutely can. You may not want it to, you may not be oriented toward this topic, but if you are, and if this is what's been the most important thing in your life up till now, or you just know it is, well, I have great news for you. You have every right to orient to that, and you have the ability to orient to that part of yourself, that part of yourself that goes so deep inside that inside and outside loses meaning. So that's what happened to me when I was 24, and that was 25 years ago now. So more than half my life has been lived after that, actually, I guess, in years. And so there was a lot of integration, and a lot happened since then, but there were very important insights that occurred at that time that weren't a gained set of knowledge, but rather the insight into the nature of how the identity is, how the world is, how reality is, how time and space are. Not that they are a certain way either. That's the weird thing about this. It's quite indeterministic. It's like Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, the idea that the universe is actually somehow based on a certain kind of indeterminacy. It has that feel to it. It has that like raw potentiality in a sense, but just manifesting as this. So So that's kind of the story of how it played out. I can talk about various parts of that if it's interesting. But what's most interesting to me isn't talking about my story, because who cares about my story? I care about your awakening, right? Anyone listening is who I'm talking to. And it can be helpful to hear this for a few reasons. One is you can get the taste of it and go, oh, and that's what happened to me. I read a book that described, it had a chapter where people described going through this in their own words. They described going through this process in a Zen setting. So it can be helpful to hear it because it gives you the flavor that, oh, I can do that. I can cross over. I can wake up from my own suffering somehow. And I've always been feeling it and I've known it. So that part of telling the story is helpful. And then also just throwing a few things out there like I usually do, like you have the right to do it. You have the ability to do it. And I know there's a lot of doubt. I know there's doubt mass. I know that, in fact, sometimes it feels like all there is doubt. A lot of hesitation in life, driving with the brakes on. It's a human thing, right? It's a human condition, the way our minds are set up. So a lot of this is just to say, I know that's there. It's okay. That's a bunch of thoughts. I'll show you how to get through those thoughts, So it's more of an encouragement than anything. But the potential downside is you'll listen to my story and then use it to doubt your own experience, to go, well, that's not happening in my experience. Trust me, you can wake up, but as you wake up, it won't look like anyone's story because it's not like a story. That's the weird thing about it. You're releasing yourself from the story, and it'll feel amazing, spacious, surprising, sometimes disorienting. You'll go through intense emotions, but it will never quite be like anyone's ever described it. It's too natural and too real to be like any description. So that's the sort of downside of me talking about it, is people can use that and sort of almost reinforce their own doubt with it, or believe it has to look like I'm describing, and it doesn't. It looks a lot of different ways, and people use different words for it. And some people don't even describe it. They don't have any impetus to even talk about it. And I didn't for many years. I didn't even, what was there to say? And at some point, I ended up talking to different people, and it seemed that people found it valuable, and people were waking up. So I felt a little more compelled to do it. And so that kind of snowballed into this, where I do have an active YouTube channel. I upload frequently. I have all that. So that wasn't overnight, and it happened little by little. And it was just kind of like life leading me to the next step, going, this is what you're going to do now. This is what you're going to do now. And it was just responding to the environment. It's responding to my interactions with people and seeing what seemed to be helpful or what's needed or whatever. And so a lot of it's just driven by feedback, and people say, oh, this worked really well. Oh, can we do more of these? These videos of you interviewing someone who's going through awakening are really helpful. And so I just do more of them. So this has all been a kind of organic unfolding with how I'm talking about it publicly over the last 7 years or something. But the real public aspect of it that kind of blew up a small explosion, not an Eckhart Tolle explosion, but over the last year and a half was because of the book. So yeah, the book was released. I had a series of interviews with a podcast, kind of an influencer named ZDogMD, and
Yes.
that pulled a lot of attention to the book, a lot of attention to me and my YouTube channel and stuff. So that was about a year. Over the last year and a half to 2 years, we've been kind of rocking as far as how much content I'm making, how much involvement there is through the content. So that's what's happening.
Okay, and to stick a little bit with your story, did you follow particular methods or schools, or did you have teachers or in particular influences, or was it just a book or an inspiration?
Yeah. For me, I didn't have a formal spiritual teacher or anything like that when I had this shift, this what I call awakening. I had a guy who I guess was somewhat of a spiritual mentor, but not really in a major way. But he taught me to meditate 5 years before that. But he wasn't really a spiritual teacher so much. He was a transcendental meditation teacher who had been doing it for many years. And but yeah, I wouldn't call him necessarily a teacher, although he did teach me to meditate. I was always interested in Eastern thought And it kind of manifested in different ways, like martial arts. I kind of was interested in martial arts, but what I finally realized is I was interested in the Eastern thought. I was interested in Buddhism, and even like Hindu thought, the Bhagavad Gita and Upanishad stuff. Even though, and Lao Tse, the Taoism, the Tao Te Ching. Now, all of that stuff I was interested in, but I didn't get it. I would read it and not get it. I would read it, like the Tao Te Ching specifically. It's like, I know there's something here, but it doesn't make any sense, right? It's just my mind would just bind up. My mind would just go, the gears would like grind into a stop or something when I would try to understand it. But I knew there was something there. I knew there was something in that literature, in what they were talking. Why were they spending so much time talking about that? And the Zen masters and the Zen teachers and these people meditating in monasteries for years and decades. Why? There's got to be something there. I just sensed that there was something there. So I think that helped, and it led me down certain pathways to bump into certain people that said the right things at the right time, just planting the seeds to kind of get me in a direction of this. When right before I had the awakening, it was reading this book called The Three Pillars of Zen. And Zen historically, especially, I don't know a lot of the history of Chinese Zen, the Chan, but Japanese Zen was pretty, well, it's austere, it's pretty rigorous, and it was traditionally closed. It was something it was hard to even get into. To even get into a monastery, you'd have to like sleep on the porch, and they would ignore you for days, and maybe they'd let you in. And so they weren't into public demonstrations and speaking and inviting the public in. It was very much a monastic tradition, largely in Japan for many years and things like that. So, so it was actually really uncommon for a Zen Roshi, a Zen master, Zen teacher, to write a book where the actual goings on inside a Zen monastery, in fact, the most important parts of that, which are Dokusan, which is the private interaction with a teacher, one-on-one, and Kensho, which is enlightenment, essentially not full enlightenment, not liberation, but the initial movement. You could call it stream entry in more like traditional Buddhism, maybe. So there was another chapter on that. So there was a chapter on each one of those. And that's really uncommon, that you get, like, you can see directly into the inner workings of Zen monks and householders working directly with a Roshi on their practices, on a koan or on meditation. And these conversations with the teacher are not, they're kind of like you and I are talking, but they're very direct, they're very experiential, and they're not informational. So that I picked that up immediately. I was like, oh, this I know what this is. And it was weird. It was really like a memory almost. I felt like I've been here. I've done this. I don't know where or how, but it felt so familiar, more familiar than my life did. And this is before awakening, like this was right before. But as I started reading these interactions with the teacher, and specifically the encounters, the enlightenment encounters, I think they called it, or enlightenment stories. These were practitioners who had gone through this process and woken up and wrote about it. And as I read those, I knew it. I knew this flavor. I said, I know that's where I'm going to go. And at that point, I mean, I'd suffered enough where I was like, I don't care if it kills me. I'm going to try in any way I can to make this happen. I'm just, and I just let go. I let go into it. So there was the teacher involved was Philip Capello Roshi, who wrote that book and compiled it in the 60s, and I got a hold of it in 1997. So that, in that sense, there was a huge lineage behind that, and a direct mind-to-mind transmission of enlightened teachers that were there to transmit a potent catalyst, not a message, but a catalyst for you to wake up. And that's what worked for me. So there was always a bit of interest in Eastern thought and mysticism and things like that. But I was always like a little bit kind of interested, kind of not, because I didn't want to learn anything about this. Like, I knew somehow that the thoughts were a big part of the problem. I didn't want more information. I wanted something real. And that, when I got a hold of those chapters, then I knew, okay, this is real. And that was it. So after awakening, I did become part of a Zen center. I meditated a lot. A lot of this was more integration, letting energies, dissolve, and reactivity dissolve, and working through emotion stuff. And like, if you have a deep awakening, you're always going to have to do that. If you have any kind of awakening, you're going to have to do that. But so I did for a handful of years. While I was still going to school and all that, I did go to the Zen center. I'd meditated there very frequently. I did have a relationship with the teacher there. We worked through some koans. It was interesting stuff. But so that was the only formal teacher I really had. And he was my teacher for a few years, I think. And I think it was helpful, but a lot of it was more integration and at an energetic level than the insight. The insight hit before that. And since then, I mean, I kind of feel like I had a lot of teachers. Like I learned from everyone. I learned from the people who are waking up. I will learn how people wake up by going through it with them. And maybe I'm facilitating it, or I'm the mirror or something, but they're doing it. You know, I can't walk you over the edge. I can walk you to the edge, but I can't walk you over the edge. And so everyone's my teacher now. Everything is my teacher. But there are some very potent teachers that I think have helped clarify even in the last 7 or 8 years. And Lisa Carnes is one of them. Adyashanti is one of them. Eckhart Tolle is one of them. Gangaji is one of them. Papaji is one of them. Even Tony Parsons is one of them. There's all these expressions have something to say. Every expression does. Even the expression of delusion has something to teach you. So for me, it became this amazing thing where really everything is teaching me all the time. It's like everything is a koan, but the koans are just solving themselves all the time. It's a kind of spontaneous process that carries itself forward, carries itself onward, carries itself inward. But there's no one in it. It's not a personal thing anymore at all.
Okay, it's fascinating. It's quite a journey. And now today, what is the focus of your teaching? Is there a core message or a core teaching in your teachings? And is there a more important thing that you want to share in your teachings?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question, or the way you asked it was good, I think. Overall, like as a general statement, I actually don't have a specific process of teaching because I can't teach anything. Reality is just how it is. It is what it is. It does what it does. It's impossible. It's possible. It's paradoxical. It's seems to appear in space, and it's also without space. It's at zero distance. There's so many paradoxes in experience and in the appearance of this. So I can't teach anything because, first of all, there's nothing there to teach. There's nothing to hang your hat on. The moment you think you understand it, it's already changed or gone or disappeared or reappeared. So there's a kind of flux that's always here. So if I could say anything about it, it ends up being about synchronicity. It's all about timing. I could say the same exact thing to somebody in the correct timing, and they may have a shift. If I say that out of timing, and that would be my own delusion. If I said it to the wrong person at the wrong time, it could actually be detrimental to them, for instance. So that's why really rigid messages, I won't name any names, but really rigid messages can be very valuable for some people, but they can actually be detrimental for other people. And they can be really detrimental if misapplied with not with skillful means. So there has to be an organic, synchronistic dance to really do this justice, in my opinion. So the way I teach, the way I reflect, the way I work with somebody changes all the time, and it's really about where they are in that moment. It's just what's happening with that person. Another general way I could say it is what I do pretty much is I feel fixation, and I just notice it. I notice fixation because reality doesn't fixate, and I'm not even saying there's an objective reality, but just for comparison and to give it a word, living truth, the Dharma, it doesn't fixate. The energy field, it doesn't fixate at all. The human mind tries to fixate all the time. So I can feel that fixation when I'm working with somebody, and I don't point it out or make it wrong. I just feel into it with them one way or another. And then out of that energetic experience, I say something, or I say, hey, have you looked at this? Or have you considered this question? Or look into this. And a lot of it is just what they actually ask. A lot of it, they already know what they need to address or want to address. They kind of just want a little bit of permission to do it and maybe a little bit of pointing. And so we just kind of do it together. It's really a mutual thing. It's not a big deal. It's not like I have some special information. It's nothing like that. So it's synchronistic. It's a bit of a dance, and it's really timing based. So that's the kind of general thing I would say about my approach or teaching. It's definitely not about principles, and it's not about dogma. Now I can say a few specific things that are just trends. So one trend is that there are certain barriers that come at different stages of people's sort of insight level or whatever. And these stages aren't so much built on top of one another. They're more like scaffolding falling out from underneath, and you find
Mhm.
yourself in a bigger space. It's something like that. They're perceptual filters that get dissolved. But there are somewhat consistent barriers that seem to pop up for people in this process. And the very first one really is even recognizing what suffering is. There are many people who don't even know that they're suffering. And that sounds really weird to say, and I can't actually tell anyone they're suffering or not. I can't say that to them. But the reason I can say it this way is because I've had so many experiences where someone will either hear what I'm saying or their partner talks about suffering and they say, I don't suffer. And then like a few months later, they're like, oh my God, I'm suffering. I've been suffering all these years. I didn't even know what it was. It's like a fish in water doesn't know what water is. That's how much suffering is really infused in the human psyche. And again, some people are really sensitive to it, meaning it's just so uncomfortable they have to do something about it. Other people, it's just sort of in the background, or they kind of don't notice it. But the first stage or the first barrier is just to realize like we are suffering. If you need an external way to do that, to investigate it, just look at the things humans get themselves up to in the world. We don't do all bad, but we sometimes do bad, and we do really bad, some really horrible things. It's at a small level and at very broad scales, right? So yeah, there's some delusion and some hatred and some ignorance and selfishness that runs through the human psyche, of course, right? But to recognize that, oh my gosh, that's really causing me to suffer, whether it's internal or external, I can feel it. That's the first barrier, is just even to be authentic enough to know that you're suffering. And really that lines up with Buddhism. It would be the first noble truth, that life, and it would probably be life as usually lived, is unsatisfying. It's suffering, right? Doesn't mean that life has to be suffering, but as the human usually experiences it's a sort of suffering. So I would say that's the first barrier. Then the second barrier is, well, okay, so I've recognized that I'm suffering, but do I even know that there's anything I can do to address it? And that's kind of where I was, like I said before, for most of my life before I came close to awakening. It was like I knew something just felt so uncomfortable, but I was almost scared to even admit to myself that I didn't know what to do about it, because then that's just a hopelessness, right? So once you start to taste the possibility, however that happens, that, oh, I can actually address this, that's you've gotten through another barrier, and that's the barrier that you just don't even realize that anything could be done about it. And then the next barrier tends to be something like just self-doubt. Like, okay, I know people wake up. I've seen it now. I've watched videos of people going through awakening. I've read, I've gotten a taste of expansiveness myself. Maybe I've gotten a taste of even non-duality myself. Happens all kinds of different ways now. Psychedelics are a big one now, through self-inquiry, through prolonged meditation at a retreat. You've tasted it, and yet something in you's like, it's not going to be me though. Like, that guy woke up, sure, there must be something special about him, or she woke up, but I'm sure there's something I don't have, right? And often this is in the background. It's not even, we don't even overtly realize that we have that much self-doubt, but it's there. So we believe, now we're starting to actually believe in the possibility. Energetically, we know it's there, but we just don't believe it's about us somehow. And that doubt mass kind of sticks around right up until awakening, usually, and in some form or another. As you're starting to get through that a little bit, to where you're like, oh, I don't care, I'm going to work at this. Like, I'm going to start to dig in, even though I really can't know for sure if it's going to work. You're starting to move through that barrier. But then the next barrier can be like, well, what do you do? Like, do you actually do something? Do you do nothing? Do you pick up a technique? Do you ask yourself, what is mu? Do you self-inquire? Do you whatever? So the next barrier is sort of, do you take it into practical means? Do you actually start doing something, whether it's a practice, self-inquiry, going to retreats, making space for this in your life, right? And that's an important barrier to get past. And anyone who's listening to this and might be asking themselves, well, what about the Neo-Advaita message that says there's nothing to do, there's no one to do it, no one can self-inquire? I'm going to tell you right now, everyone you've ever heard say that, every person on YouTube that said that, already went through this phase I'm talking about. Those are people who worked very hard, went to retreats, meditated, did self-inquiry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. So it is a phase, and but it's probably an important one, and it's a buy-in. It's when you just say to the universe, like, no, I'm serious about this, and you do it through action. Yeah. Even Ramana Maharishi said somewhere, nothing is achieved without effort, or something to that, to along those lines. So that's the next barrier. And then when you're really coming up close to awakening, you feel it. You're building the ability to like drop back out of thoughts, realize that place that is not it's not conceptually bound at all. Presence, let's call it unbound consciousness, maybe the I am sense, in the proper meaning of I am sense. You start to experience that, then there may not be a barrier. You may just drop right through. But sometimes it's a little technical in the sense that you're just getting caught by very subtle thoughts. I see this frequently, that your heart's in it, your intention's in it, you're working at it, you know how to let go, you know how to get past thoughts, you know how to find the gap, you know how to take the backward step in a sense, but there's just these subtle thoughts that are catching you and you don't realize it. Like, like, oh, I get bored or something like that. Once you've gotten past that, then there's this thing that usually happens as a fear barrier. And it can happen at different times, but it's often once you've really gotten all this other stuff out of the way, your mind has gotten calm, you'll feel an intense fear. Like, whoa, I feel like I'm stepping into the unknown. I'm stepping off a cliff. That one people usually navigate on their own. They back off and they're like, whoa, I don't know what that was. And then 2 weeks later, they're meditating again and they just go through it, you know. But I do try to point it out that it can happen and it's okay when it happens. And, you know, if you just wait it out, usually it will subside. So those are some of I don't necessarily reference those and then teach from that, but I do see them come up consistently and I do have to navigate it with people frequently. So there are some reasonably consistent patterns to how this unfolds. Again, with that said, don't be looking at your own experience and going, okay, I've gone number 1 and 2, but not 3. This isn't everyone. Everyone's a little different. Some people blow through these things really quick and then they get stuck in a different place, and everyone's just very different. So, and for some people, it's not as much a practice. It's not really, they just naturally do surrender. Often people have had a tremendous amount of suffering, just really suffered in life. They're like, why wouldn't I let go once you tell me to? I want to let go of this. Like, it's been nothing but pain, you know? So some people are really good at just surrendering too. So it's just different depending on the person, the conditions, the situation, and sort of where they are in this unfolding. Is that helpful?
Yeah. There's a lot of material here. And so I hear that there's kind of a map, but it's not really a map, and we can't mix the map with the territory. So it's but I have a question on awakening. So is it a start or is it the end of the path? In other words, is there awakening is awakening the full liberation, and what does it mean to be awakened?
Yeah, when I use the term awakening, I often will say first awakening. Sometimes I'll use the Zen term, which is Kensho. Satori is another Zen term. Stream entries, more like traditional Buddhist term from like the suttas. When I use that term, I'm almost always meaning the first big shift in identity, And it can be a deep taste. It can be deep, so you're actually tasting the sense of no self at all, but not always. Some people don't sense that until later. They more experience the sense of self as everything, like I am sense. And it may be how you come about this first shift, depending on whether you are more of a advaita, Vedanta, if you're wired that way, like Ramana would speak, and even Nisargadatta. But it just varies. The depth of that initial shift varies, but it really is the beginning. That's rightfully the beginning of your true spiritual unfoldment, culminating essentially in what I would call liberation. And to think and when it happens, when that first shift occurs, it is so striking experientially for the person. They don't even really reflect on themselves in a way that says I'm enlightened or something like that, because there's not that kind of arrogance about it. But there's something about it that feels like, how could it get more clear than this? Everything's so clear. There's nothing but clarity. Before, everything was confusing and doubtful, and right, the mind was just doubting, and now that's just quiet. The mind gets very quiet. So you do feel, may not conclude that you're done, but it feels like, how could this get more clear? You know, Adyashanti has mentioned this in certain ways, and he's right on the money that there's something about realization that every stage of it, every time something else drops out, it still feels like it's like kind of the whole thing already. It's like once you come into contact with ultimate reality, let's say, or whatever, it has that flavor of completeness to it. And there's something very sweet about that. And it's great. But in the relative sense, in the human sense, you're not done. You got some work to do. And a lot of it's in the emotion spectrum. It's about emotion, repressed emotion, resistance patterns, beliefs, and then subtle perceptual filters that have to do with duality and time and space and things like that. But those are a little harder to address. They're actually a lot harder to address earlier when there's a lot of reactivity, resistance, unconsciousness about emotions, things like that. That stuff is really strong after your honeymoon period. Often, like you'll go through this period of after awakening where, again, it feels extremely clear, peaceful, blissful. You'll be like, how could there be anything? I'll see anything. I'm willing to look anywhere, be anything, go any direction. Like there's such fluidity. You can't even imagine how you're going to feel resistance again. Then you do, and you're like, oh, okay, that's how you feel it. It's very physical, actually. And so then you're led down into the body, into the emotion body, and then ultimately into the senses. So that work can be gritty, uncomfortable, surprising. You can feel, as I wrote in my book, rather unenlightened after for a while, and yet the spaciousness and the fluidity of identity is still there. That was realized. That doesn't go away, but you just don't realize how much unconscious material can still be there. And this is everyone I've ever met. I haven't met an exception to this, by the way. I've met people who maybe don't talk about it, but if you get to know them, they've definitely gone through it. It's just what you have to do, and it's okay. It's just part of the deal. I think Zen is pretty good about talking about this. And actually, there are more and more modalities available to help people with this part of things that could be valuable even outside of the awakening spectrum. So things like TRE, different inquiry processes, somatic practices, breathwork practices. There's just a lot of good practices now. There's more and more information on vagal nerve remyelination and things that help you to do that and just calm the nervous, start to come in confidence. Because when things are moving too much, it's just too hard to see the subtle experiences. They'll come and go. You may have a non-dual experience, but it lasts 10 minutes and it's gone. It's not like you're like, well, where'd that go? Why isn't it there? But then 10 minutes later, you're upset about something or reacting to something, and that's why. It's the reactivity just keeps things tumultuous internally, and so unless you address it directly, it can plague you for the rest of your life. Or you can go completely unconscious and convince yourself you're enlightened and convince other people you're enlightened, but you're really not, and you're very reactive, and you're and there's many contemporary teachers who have done that, and there's all documentaries about them, how they become abusive to their inner circle, and yet outwardly they act enlightened. And that's you don't want to go down that road. Just do the work and be willing to be vulnerable, honest about what you're feeling, and just be willing to go down and feel it and see it and experience it, and work with a teacher who can actually help you see it honestly and work through it, instead of someone who's gonna, well, sometimes people just don't even have a teacher, and that's okay. You don't have to have a teacher, but having someone who can kind of help facilitate this process can be quite useful, because again, it's looking in the place you're not inclined to look. You're looking out from it, so it's hard to look back into the shadow on your own. You can, and there's techniques and inquiry and all this, but it's worth doing, and you really should take this challenge up. So that's kind of the middle ground between that first awakening and then the deep stage insights, which have to do with like the experience of duality in the physical environment and things like that.
When you talk about liberation, it's liberation from what?
Suffering.
Okay. And what's suffering?
Suffering is suffering is based on the belief that I can form a self that's apart from the world, that can react to the world and act with agency, ultimately to make itself feel better. That's an illusion. It's just an illusion. So, and a very good description of how that gets built is like if you look at the Buddhist fetter model, the fetters describe like the layers of it. And so if you look at it, you're like, okay, well, what would I have to believe so that this maybe mildly uncomfortable experience right now, I could actually do something about it? Well, first of all, I'd have to believe I'm apart from it, separation. Then I'd have to believe I have agency. Then I'd have to believe, and the result of that is a self that can think and make choices. So you actually deconstruct that all the way back down. And what you find is very surprising that you actually don't, it's actually completely okay. It's okay that some things feel uncomfortable and some things don't. And I know that's a very simple statement, but you can't just believe your way into that. It turns out you really have to go through this whole cascade until you see it exquisitely clearly that there is actually no reason to react to anything. There's no one that can do it. There's nothing apart from anything else that could even start to react. And it turns out, and that's completely okay, that things are just how they are. They could not be other. There's no one who needs to change them, do anything about them, fix them. Some things are uncomfortable, some things are comfortable, but none of it's really a big deal. Yeah. And I know that's, again, very simple, but that's ultimately what liberation means. Liberation from delusion, from the fundamental delusion.
It's simple, maybe it's simple, but not easy to do, and it's a lot of practice. And do you think that there is one practice or one that can fit to everyone? Maybe meditation or self-inquiry, which are the more the more popular in the scene, in spiritual scene. And do you think that these tools can be can open someone to achieve liberation?
Yeah, I would say the most potent tool, in my opinion, in my experience, is inquiry. But I would encourage someone who's really interested in that to read my chapter on inquiry, because there's a bit to unpack about it. It has to be authentic at some level. You have to actually be curious about what you're inquiring into. You also have to know what you're looking for and what you're not looking for when you ask a question. You have to, and you have to really get the sense of the value of asking. The value of asking is you're already admitting you don't know. And the more you ask, the more you realize it's okay not to know. The question can lead you into experience rather than knowledge. Once you get that and you have genuine curiosity and you keep working at it, then inquiry is going to work for you. It's going to take you deeper and deeper and deeper. Now, one form of inquiry that's specific to this first shift we're talking about is self-inquiry. And self-inquiry is great if it makes sense to you, if it feels authentic to you. If it doesn't, then you can just look for a different question maybe. But if you can inquire into the nature of self and be interested in that question, who am I? Right now, who am I? And then any thought that comes, okay, well, I know I'm not that because that's a thought, because I was here before that thought, right? So let's say I'm here and there's no thoughts for a moment. All right. And then all of a sudden a thought says, oh, I'm Angelo from the United States. And then that thought dissipates and I'm here again. So I was there the whole time before that thought came. I was there when the thought came, and I was there after the thought came. So apparently I'm Angelo from the United States is not who I am. That's a thought. So then it begs the question, well, who am I then? Then you look back again into the space or into the sense of I or into the sense of me. If you find that interesting, if you find it valuable as you do it, that's a great line of inquiry. But I try not to pigeonhole inquiry into self-inquiry, because there's other ways to inquire that are very valuable that don't have to do with trying to find the self or fall back into the self or take the backward step. It works for some people, other people don't get it. So another form of inquiry could just be what's here right now that's not a thought. That's a great inquiry, because, well, how much content you experience is thought, and yet, what is it that's curious? Is that a thought? What's actually asking the question? Is that a thought? What's here when there's no thought to define any experience, and yet there's something here? What is that? Right? Again, it's important to remember we can ask these questions without needing to come up with a conceptual answer, meaning an answer that I'm going to write down, that I'm going to remember, or that I'm going to tell my friends I figured out. You don't need any of that. The point is to lead you into experience, not into knowledge. If you're using inquiry that way, it's a potent practice. And I know people who've woken up doing that without even knowing they were doing that. They didn't realize that's what it was, but that's what they were doing. So that to me really is the most important thing. And it's also because it's personal. If it's authentic, it's personal. Like Christ said, knock and it will be opened. Or Rumi said, I was knocking on the door and the door opened, I was on the inside. But the point is, to knock on a door, you have to be curious. You have to be wonder what's on the other side of it. If you bring that kind of curiosity into your own self, into your own experience, things start happening. And that's probably my best answer for what I think the most potent technique is. There's a lot of ways to apply inquiry. There's a lot of settings in which to apply inquiry. Doing it in a meditation retreat where you're doing sustained meditation for days, that's very potent. It's a different sort of thing than not being in that environment, but it's not necessary either. So other things that I think are valuable, other than inquiry, meditation is certainly valuable. It is. I just don't equate a meditation with awakening, because it doesn't equate. I mean, there are people who meditate for years and years and don't wake up, and there are people who wake up who don't meditate. So they're not equivalent in my mind or in my book. In some disciplines, they kind of are, but not to me. But meditation is valuable. It really is. It calms the mind, calms the body, gives you a space in which to inquire or to look or to relax or to surrender. So I would say that's a valuable thing to do, is have a sort of meditation daily practice. Another thing that's valuable to do, read books by or watch videos by someone who can really transmit. Transmit means you listen and they're transmitting something to you that's beyond the words. You can feel it, like good poetry, and poetry may be it, but interacting with that person, whether it's through a book, through a video, or in direct interaction, is valuable for sure. And then I've mentioned a couple of times, but sustained meditation, I think, is actually valuable. Doing some kind of retreat, even if it's an online retreat at home. Sustained meditation over days is a very, very different experience than doing daily meditation for a half an hour. I'm not going to say it's better. It's just very different. It's much more concentrated, puts you in a different headspace, let's say. So those are the kind of things that I would recommend for someone who's really, really interested in this process, to kind of orient to those as practices. Yeah.
Okay. And can someone go to awakening with your book, only with your book, and use it as a guide to awakening?
Yeah, I think they can. I really tried to make it exhaustive. I put a lot in there, and I try to be really, I reworded it many times. I edited it many times so that there's a lot of depth in what I say. So people who've read it over and over often tell me they get more out of it each time. So I do think it can, but it's nothing special about my book necessarily. Everyone has a different formula or recipe. I'm not the kind of person who says only use my resources and materials. I recommend other people all the time, because you never know who's going to work for certain people, and there are other really good teachers. So, but I have seen people wake up many, many times reading my book. I've had much correspondence about that since it's been selling. It sells, like, I don't know, 500 copies a month or something. I've even people in very deep stages of realization, it's helped them through subtle fixation. So even though it's generally geared towards first awakening, as I write in the book. There's much in there that is the same stuff I use working with people after awakening. A lot of emotion stuff, insight work, working with your attention and things like that. So yeah, I think it is, and I really tried to make it like a cohesive, exhaustive resource for awakening. That was it. I was kind of like, what would I have wanted to pick up when I was 19 years old and suffering? But there are other good books. There are other really good books. Eckhart Tolle's Power of Now is a really, really good book that's so accessible to kind of anyone. Like, you don't have to have that much spiritual interest or knowledge to just read his book and something touches you, like something clicks, and he's just good that way. Adyashanti, all his stuff's really good. His books are great. If you're really all about like direct inquiry and especially moving to deeper stages of realization and so forth, Greg Good, Goode, he has some books like The Direct Way, things like that, Direct Path, and so he's got some good stuff.
The Direct Path is a really, really good book, and I interviewed him on the channel, and he's very, very accessible. So
yeah, I want to interview him as well. Was it recent that you did that?
maybe 1 year ago, but he was reluctant to do it on video. So we did it by writing, and he read the English version, and I read the French version. So, but you can contact him very easily.
Yeah, so he's a good resource, and his and there are a lot of good video resources too. Of course, there's plenty of people who have all kinds of videos online, depending on the style you like and the kind of teaching and teacher and stuff like that. So yeah.
Maybe can you do you consider that there is contraindications to your approach, or more generally to inquiry? Maybe some problems with mental illness, etc.
Yeah, so I would say if someone has a history of psychosis specifically, maybe like schizophrenia diagnosis, schizoaffective disorder, or other kinds of like instability where they've had inpatient psychiatric treatment, and that I'm not saying that person is not able to wake up. They certainly are. But I would recommend, rather than going it on your own, especially doing hardcore practices of like self-inquiry all day long, going to long retreats, I would recommend them actually finding a teacher who can work with them, who's walked this path before, who can really keep an eye on them and gauge how they're doing. And so just a more intimate interaction with a teacher would probably be better for someone in that situation. And the other thing is, there are people who dissociate a lot, like derealization, depersonalization, and like intense disassociation. Someone who tends to do that, I have worked with people who do really well, because they tend to be very clear people, but they have this sort of disassociating avoidant tendency and they use the consciousness to do it. So expansive practices, self-inquiry practices, may not be the best for someone like that. I actually may recommend a lot of like emotion work and sensory integration work and things like that. So so there are nuances depending on where you are. But a lot of this is just, if you have instability in life, you've had, psychiatric treatments, things like that. A lot of times it's just a matter of look around. If you're serious about this process, look around and just find a teacher that you can kind of work a little bit closely with. And then when it comes to psychiatric illness and so forth, people tend to do well. I've seen many people with bipolar disorder go through this process, but I usually say things like, don't make major decisions when you have major shifts. I tell everyone this, actually. Right after awakening, don't drop out of college, don't get divorced, don't do something, don't make big decisions, just enjoy it. Just sit and relax and sit in that consciousness for several months. If you really think you want to drop out of graduate school, wait 6 months and see when you're thinking a little differently. And so I often tell people, don't make major decisions, including changing medications or stopping psychiatric medications, like right after you have big shifts. Just let things settle, and take it slowly, and that. So that's another piece of advice I give especially about medications and stuff.
Maybe I have a related question. It's when someone has a big shift, how to keep one's feet on the ground and not to little illusions about one's achievements, because one can say, "Oh, I'm a Buddha now, and let's open a shop and sell a lot of books. Maybe it's a good idea." So, how to keep one's feet on the ground?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, specific to kind of letting the ego completely take over in that way of thinking you're done and you're a Buddha and stuff. The challenge with that is the kind of person that's going to do that probably isn't going to listen to this advice, but maybe they will. Who knows? So I'll give it. My best advice there would really to be find a good teacher who's honest with you and run it by them. Ask them if they think you're a Buddha yet. Be humble. Realize it's the beginning, not the end. Be open to feedback from everyone, including people who you think are unenlightened, like your family, your partner. They tell you you're being a jerk.
It's
Ask them
Christmas
why.
time, so
Ask for specifics. Yeah, it's Christmas time. Go spend time with your family.
yeah.
So, be humble, be vulnerable, be open, be honest, and if you can have a direct interaction with a teacher who will keep you honest, that's very valuable. Don't get yourself into situations that are really hard to get out of. Take it easy. Yeah, it's challenging with the people who have, and I haven't worked directly with anyone I can think of, but people who have that really deeply rooted and unrecognized need for validation, and then they have an awakening, and then they get a group of people following them, and then they start getting weird. Like that does happen, and it's happened still. So I don't know how to avoid that, because I wonder if that person's just already set up for it in a sense. More what I'm interested in is telling people how not to become that person's student. how to look for a good teacher, and how to look for red flags, and do not ignore red flags. Just don't ignore red flags. If you see an abusive teacher, don't justify it. Go find another teacher. If they're abusive to anyone, it's not worth it. There's good teachers out there. So a lot of it's more about like, be cautious about and be selective about who you consider to be a good teacher or your teacher, and watch for cult tactics, love bombing, all of this stuff, manipulating people, all of it, watch some documentaries about it. There's some good documentaries about, contemporary cults too, that, and the cult leader type person, or the really, I guess you call it like almost God complex person, they have very specific characteristics. It's all underpinned by this like really big fear of losing validation, or fear of not having validation. So they have a reaction formation, to put it in a Freudian terminology, and they become this, they take on this persona that's just overblown. But yeah, there are consistent patterns in people who are leaders that can be abusive and whatever, fake guru types. So watch for those kinds of things, and do yourself a favor by picking a good teacher, being selective. And if you see something strange, get out of there. Yeah.
Yes, that's good advice. Okay, now that we are coming to the end of the interview, can you tell us what maybe you have some events or retreats or online events? Can you tell us?
There's an online event retreat. It's, I think, 5 days. It's towards the end of January. My website is simplyalwaysawake.com. And if you go to the live events, retreats, you can see it there. It's cheap. If I think I said $50 if US. If you can't pay that, pay 20. If you can't pay 20, don't pay anything. You can do it for free. But do pay if you can afford, just so that there's some buy-in there. But if you can't, it's totally fine. It's 5 days. It's online. I do guided meditations, talks, and Q&As. There's going to be also Violet is going to do the sound meditations. She does a great job with that. And then the other retreat I have scheduled right now, and I may have something in between, but right now it's the next live retreat in person is in North Carolina in November. It's a really beautiful place. It's in the mountains. It's all misty and it's gorgeous. But it's called the Art of Living Retreat Center. And you can find that also on my website under retreats. And that's in person for 6 days, I believe. We just did one this year, and it was awesome, really cool. And so same format, there's guided meditation, there's sound meditation, there's Q&A. And it's nice because it's kind of all inclusive. You pay and you know, you're done for the week, and the foods are taken care of, all of it's taken care of, and you can just sit, meditate, walk in the woods and inquire. And so those are the retreats coming up. But I always like to tell people I have an app that's free. It's called Simply Awake, and it has free guided meditations on it. There's like 60 some on there, so you can get that on either platform.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you again for your time and for your teachings.
Yeah.
And maybe we will have the occasion to talk again, maybe in a few months with other questions. Thank you again.
Thank you for inviting me. It was really nice having this chat.